The Causeway of Try, a pre-Sven Kingdoms long short story noveletta by Angus Rorison, read by the author. Chapter 1. Young Bob the Great. 2,000 years ago, that is, about 1,000 years before the magnificent Sven conquered and tamed the land, ridding it of all barbarians and many beasts, there was another, a mighty warrior feared and famed from coast to coast and back again, one who, even though he was only 25¼ years old, had led his armies across the breadth of the continent in a merciless tirade of triumph. He was known as Young Bob, for his name was Bob, and he was young. Cities, kings and queens cowered before him, submitting to his will. They really did have to cower, as Bob was not a tall man. At 14 years of age, he had been of good height for his age, but as his peers grew in stature, he did not. He only grew in ambition. He was not destined to be a king, but king he did become, and, in time, emperor. As he was camped outside the once mighty city of Dinar one warm night, he spread maps before him and his generals. "Mind out, will you?" he barked at one unnaturally tall commander. "You're in my light!" The light in question came not from candles or lamps, but from the burning of the once mighty city of Dinar. Its citizens fled as the flames engulfed their homes in Bob's latest display of his savage power. What, you may ask, had been their crime? What utterances had so irked the emperor as to unleash such punishment on the city? Surely it had been something so utterly reprehensible as to cause the conflagration now consuming their commune. It was simple. Faced with Bob and his entourage, the elders of the great and lavish city of Dinar presented themselves. Bob was to demand the surrender of the city to his superior army. A courtier stepped forward and in a loud and proud voice spake thusly. "Behold Bob the Great, conqueror of all the lands betwixt all four shores of the known world. Bow down before him and—" Bob silenced his spokesman with a wave of his hand. Something had occurred that had caught his magisterial attention. "Which one of you dared to chortle?" he demanded. The Dinar representatives looked nervously from one to the other. They had no personal experience of this marauder, but they had heard rumours of his merciless temper. One pointed to the other, and the other pointed to another, until eventually their fingers aligned on one man at the front. Despite the situation, he had a slight smirk upon his face. No, really, it's nothing," the man protested. No, countered Bob. "If you've something to share with the group, then we'd all like to hear it." I'm sure nothing was meant," tried another of the Dinar elders. He was stopped by a sharp look from Bob. "Look, okay, it's nothing really. I mean," sputtered the accused, but with another look from Bob, he felt compelled to continue. He sighed. "Well, really, I mean, I was just thinking, you're this great emperor and all, and we didn't know which one was you." "And?" pressed Bob. "Well, Bob the Great. I just expected you to be taller is all." "Right, that's it!" shouted Bob. The Dinar congregation flew into panic. They protested, they pleaded, they shoved the miscreant to the fore, begging Bob to take him, insisting that he did not represent their views in any shape, manner or form. But it was too late. "Burn it! Destroy this petty city!" screamed Bob, turning on his heels and departing the way he had come. The elders of Dinar fell to their knees in vain. Bob had been insulted, and there was no way back for them. This is why the Great One did not need candlelight that night in order to read his map. But the story does illustrate why he needed someone to move so that he could receive that light. Short he may have been, but he refused to let that handicap him in any manner. His father had been deaf and one-legged, and that had not stopped him overthrowing tyrants to make himself king, so Bob was not going to let being 5'2" get in the way. The flames of Dinar flickered light across his map, and he thoughtfully fiddled with his favourite new jewelled dagger. His generals and advisers leaned in, being careful not to overshadow him or the map. At last he filled the moment with speech. "What," he asked, pointing with his dagger, "is that?" He slammed down the point of the dagger onto the westernmost edge of the map. General Genikos, a wise old soldier who had served his father for decades before him, moved closer, bringing out a looking-glass to aid himself. "That, my king, is the city island of Try." "Try?" quizzed Bob. "Try? And why have I never heard of this place? Why does it not genuflect before me in obedience?" "Well," began Genikos, wondering how to put it delicately, "Try is, he stroked his small beard. "Tricky. Yes, that's a word for it. You see, it has been there since, nay, before recorded time began. It's only a quarter of a mile from the shore, yet none have succeeded in breaching its walls." "Then I shall—" "Well, Majesty, I would advise against it. It really is of no consequence." "No consequence? Is it not of this world?" Genikos had to agree that it was actually part of the known world, such as it was known back then. "Well, then it shall be mine." Bob the Great had spoken. Bob's word was law. Chapter 2. Fiona the First, founder of Try. It's true, Try was a tricky place. It had remained independent ever since Fiona the First had landed there. Not that she'd actually wanted to land there. She had been taken on a sailing lesson by her father. Fiona was the 9th daughter of her father, a once wealthy merchant. His wealth had leaked from him gradually as one daughter after another had been married off. Each had commanded a dowry, a gift of money and goods to the new husband's family. Her father, driven to distraction through the worry around the weddings, had decided enough was enough. He simply couldn't afford to let Fiona wed. She was placed in a small training boat, and he towed her out to sea before encouraging her to raise her sail as he had done his. She pulled on the rope, expecting 8 feet of cloth to unfurl and be filled with wind as had her father's. No such luck. Her sail was naught but a torn rag, fuller of holes than the infamous cheese made by her eldest sister's husband, Tony. Her father sailed effortlessly across the bay, zigzagging expertly across the wind towards home, whilst she drifted perilously west. As luck would have it, she did not drift far. The tide took her to an island, a desultory, overlooked piece of volcanic rock a quarter of a mile from the shore. The next day rumours were rife that a devil had inhabited the rocky island offshore, and the eagle-eyed could spot said devil attempting to communicate with the town via signals that could only be taken as insults of the very worst kind. Ones that questioned the genetic inheritance of those watching, or suggested that they indulged in the most unclean practices, possibly even being far too friendly with an array of common farm animals. This continued for a few days until one brave sailor ventured close enough to check out the devil. Of course, what he found instead was a furious but attractive young lady. When encouraged to return to the mainland, she declined, instead insisting that she would set up her own town on the island and taunt all those who came near her without invite. And so it was that Try was founded, becoming a rich sea-trading city. Anyone with the right skills and ambition flocked to the new place and was welcomed by Fiona the First. She insisted on being called mayoress, not queen, and ever since it has usually been a woman who has led the people of Tri, encouraging their strange traditions and ways and fighting off invaders with harsh words or, if necessary, harsh weaponry. 500 years later. Chapter 3. Bob Tries. There was nothing particularly remarkable about the day. The seers had noted no weather events that were propitious, and it could not have been said to be a beautiful day, but nor was it overcast or wet or cold. It just was. One thing Bob's seers had done was to slaughter a pig and check its entrails for omens. Bob was keen to get on with the day's invading, seeing as he could see his prey just offshore. "Well, well," he impatiently prompted. The 3 seers, 2 elder and 1 apprentice, shifted uneasily and looked at each other, all hoping the others would speak first. To be honest, they had seen nothing in the arrangement of guts that had been spilled. Usually they prompted each other and just made it up, talking about the particularly entwined nature of the innards. However, this time, the intestine was not sitting on top of the kidneys, and there was little or nothing special about the liver. It all just sat and steamed. The elders glared at the apprentice. The apprentice's name was Ziba. Everyone called him Bidoop, because that's where he came from. It was because they couldn't pronounce his surname. He had been captured as a slave after his town was ransacked, but due to some skill with medicinal herbs, he had ended up with the seers. He shrugged, thinking he really shouldn't be there. He'd requested a course on Scatomancy, not this. He was far more interested in telling the future through observing poop than guts, but unfortunately his professor had fallen into quicksand the previous week and vanished before his first proper lesson was scheduled. Unlike the others, he had not had enough life experience to be scared of young Bob, and he certainly didn't feel any loyalty to the small emperor, seeing as he was hundreds of miles from his home and what may have been left of his family. So he launched into an improvised response. "When a tide turns, it signifies your greatest moment, O great emperor," he began. Bob looked interested. The elder seers looked taken aback at this turn of events. They encouraged him with wide eyes and a slight wave of the hand. The enemy are weakening by the hour. Restlessness grows within their walls, and they will soon surrender to your mightiness." "Ah, good," offered Bob, nodding his head. There was a pause. "Any more?" he asked. Yes," continued the apprentice, in absence of any contribution from the others. "And if they offer resistance, it shall be overcome. A show of force will lead to defections." Murmured Bob, staring at the ex-pig laying at his feet. The apprentice realised that he had not made reference to the guts. He prodded it with a stick. "See how the gizzard slips easily across the esophagus there? This is a sure sign of victory. But—" He moved aside an intestine. "Yes," he muttered ominously. "Action must be taken swiftly. If there's no surrender by nightfall, there could be trouble. The gods will not be patient." He looked up hopefully at his emperor. Bob was nodding profusely. He turned to his generals. "Well, well," he snapped. "What are we waiting for? You heard the man. Move it. Prepare my boat. I will go and demand their city as forfeit." Genikos didn't quite understand the bit about forfeit, as no related consequence had been mentioned, but he was used to such tiny confusions of speech from his master. He barked orders and followed the Great One to the shore. Bob, Genikos, and Cedric the spokesman, chosen for his loud voice, boarded the small vessel along with a dozen soldiers, and the slaves were ordered to row the quarter-mile to Tri. The city was surrounded by a high and thick wall, which came almost up to the edge of the sharp rocks that were its home. Bob and his entourage sailed up to a deserted jetty in front of a huge gate which was the height of at least 7 men, or women. Everyone had retreated inside the city, leaving the usually bustling piers and jetties in ghostly silence. Cedric stood up. He was very tall and thin, which was another factor that helped him to project his voice all the way to the top of the city's ramparts. "Hear ye! Hear ye!" hailed Cedric. "In the name of Bob the Great, I demand an audience." His voice bounced off the sheer stone wall in front of them for a few seconds before a head appeared, then 2 hands. The head leaned over. "What?" "I said, hear ye, hear, yes, all right, I heard you the first time. I meant what, as in what do you want? We're a bit busy at the moment." Bob, Cedric and Genikos exchanged bemused looks. To Bob's ears it was verging on impertinence. Cedric was about to holler again when the figure at the top spoke first. "Look, just let us know what you want and make it quick, okay? You've turned up at rather an inopportune moment, see? Today's a holiday day. We all get a late morning lie-in. In fact, I've been up since dawn, what we're taking first watch and all. I'm just about to go off and have my breakfast with the missus and then have my kip, so if you wouldn't mind." This had the effect of flicking a switch in Bob's mind. He took it as cheek. He didn't like cheek. He wasn't used to it, and he wasn't going to stand for it. He stood up and marched to the prow of the boat. "Listen here, you. You listen to me, and you listen good. I am Bob the Great, and I am here—" "You what?" called the figure from above. "Speak up, mate. I can't hear a thing." "Hang on." He disappeared, and a short while later 3 more heads popped over the ramparts. "Now, say it again. Let's see if anyone else gets it," cried the first man. Bob shook with indignation. "I am Bob the Great, and I demand—" No, called out the 4 above him. "Let the other guy have a go. He's louder." Bob stamped his foot, shook his fist, and slammed a knife into the side of the boat, but to no avail. He had to leave it to Cedric to continue the attempt at conversation. Cedric steeled himself. "Bob the Great and his armies have conquered lands on all 4 corners of the known world, and—" "4? Did you say 4? I mean, it's pretty cornery if you travel all the way round it." "I'd say 4 is a severe underestimation," said a voice from above. "And what about the other lands, far across the sea? There's plenty there," added another. "Hang on," said the original voice. "Who's this Bob character you keep going on about?" Bob bristled. "I am Bob," he yelled. Silence. The 4 figures leaned over. They mumbled to each other. One pointed. "Did you say you're Bob?" asked one. "Yes, for Zoon's sake," cursed the Great One. "And what do you do then?" asked another. Bob was infuriated. He picked up a nearby axe and flung it with all his might at the walled city of Troy. To be fair, he was very strong for a short chap, and it bounced along the rocks and clattered against the very bottom of the gate. "Ooh!" came the voices from above. "Temper!" Cedric intervened. "If you do not surrender your city by nightfall, we shall be forced to take it. By force!" Even he had become discombobulated by the teasing and stumbled over his words. "Well, it's like I said," said the original voice. "We're on holiday, so even if I could find the mayoress, I don't think she'd be in a fit state to organise some sort of surrender. And to be honest, she's never done anything like that before. Tell you what, try again tomorrow, eh?" Bob and his boat hot-tailed it back to shore. Mindful of the prophecy that time was of the essence, he barked at his subordinates with extra vigour. He had noted the tall, flat walls of Troy and the sharp rocks upon which the city sat. An aquatically based invasion was out of the question. Attempting to besiege the city from their boats would be the utmost folly. He could not take his army to Troy, so he had to try to bring Troy to his army. The orders rang out through every alley, road, and pathway amongst his army's camp. Every man, woman, and child of every rank was employed. They were commanded to gather any material they could and throw it into the sea between them and the enemy's stronghold. A causeway was to be built across which his army could march. Chapter 4. Scatomancy. Bob summoned the young seer who had advised him before his fateful boat trip. Ziba once more stood before the compact emperor. He figured that telling the Great One that he was doomed to failure would not be a good career move. Since his performance that morning, he had been treated differently. The two aged seers had been supplanted. Ziba had taken a risk, and it had paid off. Never mind that it was done out of a mix of boredom, fatality, and indifference, it had produced results. It was taken that he had powers, that he could see into the future, and the attention that young Bob lavished upon him had brought rewards. Already he had women who, previously out of his league, were keen to cook for him or meet him in secret at the beach or had something to show him in their tent. And he had acquired new clothes and rich tastes in wine and foreign cheeses that had never before been considered. It had been a big day. "I have prayed, your greatness," began Ziba. Bob looked serious and nodded. Ziba continued, "I have meditated and seeked visions with the gods." He wasn't sure if seeked was a real word, but figuring he'd got away with it, he continued. He was in too deep now. "And what did they reveal? Are the gods angry with me? Are we too late?" demanded Bob. The sun had started to turn a deep orange, and it was clear that building a causeway a quarter of a mile long was going to be quite some undertaking, and not something accomplished in a day. "Oh, no, no, my lord. On the contrary, it is the city of Troy that angers them," answered the new seer to the emperor. "Their impertinence has spread shock waves through the heavens." Ziba spread his arms out, waving them across the sky. Bob didn't look convinced. Ziba had to think fast. Guts. Would that convince the Great One? Slaughtering an animal always seemed to impress. However, he had been specifically told, not half an hour earlier, that they could afford no more sheep, pig, or goat killings. There was an army of 50,000 to feed, plus the women and children, the merchants, the caterers, the medical staff, the priests, and more. Ziba sighed. Maybe the game was up. Or maybe it wasn't. He heard a bleating not too far away amidst the maelstrom of activity in the middle of the camp. Perhaps he could indulge his passion and assuage Bob's need for omens. "Come, my lord," beckoned Ziba, and led Bob towards the sound of the bleating. Bob dismissed two captains who were waiting beside him and followed the newly promoted seer. They came to a small enclosure of goats. Ziba climbed over the makeshift fence. The goat's owner was about to object, but he saw the young emperor keenly following the progress of the gatecrasher, so backed off. Ziba looked down for a second and then spied out what he'd come for. "Look, my emperor!" he cried. Bob looked. He was looking at a steaming pile of goat poo. He frowned and looked up. "And?" "My lord, the future is foretold in the droppings of these animals. It has been ever thus for centuries, nay, millennia. In my homeland, the greatest of the prophets always consult this way." "This way?" "Scatomancy, my lord." Bob rubbed his chin. "Go on," he mumbled. "Look, sire. See here." Ziba poked at the pile with a long piece of straw. "There is one main pile, but these here have broken off. 3 pieces. They represent your current situation. See how one lump has created a bridge between the two. This is you conquering the sea, making a causeway to Troy." Bob nodded. And what do they say of our efforts?" "Success, my lord. The main pile is the success. It is solid, intact. You will not lose any men in your endeavours." "None?" "Well, Ziba thought he'd overstretched himself a bit there. "Hard to be specific, lord, but definitely an insignificant amount." Good, nodded Bob. Ziba sighed a deep sigh of relief, deeper than the most obscure of poems. During the exchange, he had realised 2 things. 1, he knew diddly about scatomancy, and 2, he had a talent for improvisation. Bob began to bark, not literally like a dog. He gave out orders. He gave them out loudly and sharply, and ensured they were carried to the farthest corners of the vast campsite that his army occupied. The efforts on the causeway were to double. One last small boat managed to leave Try before the siege began and the occupants were surrounded. Chapter 5. The Causeway. It took almost 5 months to build the causeway. This sounds like a long time, but back then Bob's empire measured each month by the ovulation cycle of a goat. The particular goat they had chosen for this task, Meredith, was no ordinary goat. Normally one would expect a month to be around 21 days, but Meredith seemed to be in a hurry, and her cycle lasted 16 days at most. One particular month was only 11 days long. Her keeper blamed it on the strange diet she had to endure in these foreign lands. For Bob, it was 4.5 months too long. The strain was showing. His temples bulged with stress, he sweated profusely, and his voice was hoarse from shouting. The causeway, however, was impressive. Everything and anything had been thrown into the sea in front of the humongous campsite that housed the greatest army the known world had ever known. Pebbles, stones, worn-out clothes, broken cutlery, unfixable tables, cooking pots, dead animals, food remains, holy relics from conquered lands, people who had displeased Bob. They all went in, gradually piling on top of the seabed until the waves were parted. On and on, for almost 1/4 mile. Bob's navy patrolled around the island of Try to ensure that no one left, or that no one or any supplies entered. However, Try, on the far western edge of the continent, was a great hub, a merchant's paradise. They had supplies coming out of their ears, and could have easily lasted many more months, even if Meredith's internal systems started working properly. The day arrived when the final few things had been flung into the last water between the causeway and the first rocks in front of the great gate of the city of Try. For months Bob had had to endure being looked down upon by the citizens of Try. They had peered over the ramparts, smiling, waving, teasing. Occasionally 1 or 2 of them would throw down a few chicken bones to help Bob's lot with their walkway. Bob fumed, his temples bulging ever redder. It was late afternoon. It was mild, almost warm. The all-conquering one stood on the beach and admired his handiwork. Yes, it wasn't actually him who had built it, but he would always refer to it by saying, "That causeway I built." His men and slaves had built it, ergo he had built it. It wasn't pretty, but it was certainly impressive. Walking upon it was quite an experience. In one step it crunched, in the next it squelched. There was even one point on the far side on the left that squeaked. No one knew why, and no one admitted to being responsible for it. Bob turned to the massed ranks of his army who waited expectantly. They, too, were an impressive sight. They had dressed for this occasion, having polished their weapons and shields and lit many torches. "We will proceed to the other side," said Bob to the VIPs at the front. A few began to step forward, but then thought again and stood their ground. Their leader had taken to referring to himself in the third person recently, so they couldn't be sure exactly what he meant. Luckily, he clarified. "Myself, General Genikos, Cedric the spokesman, and my seer shall proceed to the other side to offer them one final chance to surrender. Hopefully they won't, and we shall attack and slaughter them all." A cheer arose from those closest to them. It spread in a small ripple. He didn't have a very loud voice, and the vast majority of the 50,000 didn't know whether to join in with the cheer, as they didn't know what it was about. In fact, to be honest, about 48,000 of them were completely incognizant of the whole cheering matter. But we digress. "Where exactly is my seer?" demanded Bob. "Here, my lord," called out Ziba, panting and appearing from the crowd. He'd just been taking advantage of his popularity with a couple of young ladies from the far north that Bob had conquered the previous year. They were short ladies, somewhat stocky, but what they lacked in height they more than made up for in... But we digress. "Ah, the Scatomancer arrives," declared the Great One. "Ziba Badoop," said Ziba, trying to remind Bob of his name. "Yes, Scatman. Come, you have foretold of this moment. Come with me, walk on my left, Genikos on my right. Let us meet destiny." Began Ziba nervously. He didn't fancy the idea of walking across the sea to face a whole city. Confrontation wasn't his thing. But he was poked in the back and shoved forward by a fierce-looking captain of the army, so he had no choice. Confrontation it was, then. Chapter 6. Ella the Perfect Fifth. Ella the Perfect Fifth woke from her afternoon nap. Afternoon naps were very important in Troy. They still are, all these many centuries later. The people of Troy had always done things differently. For a start, they had always prided themselves on never having been conquered. As mayoress, Ella had no intention of letting this honourable tradition slide. Her faithful assistant June brought her a hot mug of tea. Tea was something so special and nice that they had decided not to trade any of it with the mainland. As a consequence, they had a lot of it. Not even 70-something days of siege had dented their store. Ella slurped confidently. The slurping showed appreciation of the tea, and June smiled sweetly at the positive gesture of thanks. A woman and a man entered the room. The woman was middle-aged and very efficient-looking. The man was older and looked like he'd missed his afternoon nap. "Ah, number 2, what news?" asked Ella, sitting up on her simple bed, mug in hand. "They have amassed on the shore of the beach. They are armed. Looks like their leader is talking to them." Number 2 stood up straight, as if to attention, which wasn't very Try-like behaviour. Ella hoped she wouldn't be chosen as mayoress at the year-end. Mind you, the position was chosen at random from all women who had passed the exam, so there was a chance that the number 2 could actually be selected as mayoress. The fact that Ella had been randomly selected consecutively proved this point. Still, no one complained. Ella was popular and things were generally going well. Just the small matter of the largest army ever known in the known world having amassed in front of them and having removed the natural barrier of the sea between them and the mainland. But Ella was a planner. Ella took one more swig of tea. It had come a long way and it was very tasty and very exclusive. She stood up. "Right, preparations. How are they? Everything in place?" "Yes, ma'am," answered number 2 efficiently. "Emergency protocol Freddy Freeloader has been activated." Ella nodded. She looked at the older man inquiringly. Yes," he mumbled. "Good," said Ella. "Few things to do and then let's go meet and greet. Yes. Everyone got their tea rations?" "Yes, ma'am." Young Bob and his entourage proceeded across the causeway, squelching, crunching and squishing until they reached the end. Ziba squeaked. Genikos looked across disapprovingly, but Ziba shrugged. He hadn't been able to help it. It was something he'd stepped on. He shuffled uncomfortably. "Squeak!" Ziba tried to find the cause of the noise by stamping on the improvised ground beneath him. "Squeak! Squeak!" "Stop squeaking!" barked Genikos. The noise had alerted someone at the top of the wall above the gate. Unfortunately for the invaders, it was Terry, known as Terry the Taunter, the same man who had teased them on their first visit to Troy. Unknown to the visitors below, Terry had withered legs. He was fond of spending time on the ramparts and volunteered for lookout duty as much as possible, getting up and down by means of a bucket and pulley system that used a large stone as a counterweight. The stone weighed exactly what he did, so he was able to pull himself up and down with ease. For most others, it was easier and quicker to use the stairs. Since her room was near the top of the northern tower, Ella made her way to the wall above the front gate, walking briskly along the narrow alleyways of the city's ramparts. By the time she reached the front, on the east, she realised she was too late. Terry had got to the visitors before her, and there was a small crowd of onlookers. Terry couldn't help himself. He only wished that Bob's army was directly behind the squat emperor. It had begun with the usual proclamation from Cedric. "His Greatness the Emperor Bob demands that now you surrender. This is your final—" Yes, blimey, don't you give it a rest, mate. I reckon you've got louder since we met," interjected Terry. "Oh, the gods of the high seas, it's that same idiot from before," noted Genikos. Bob drew his sword. "Oh, he's got a sword!" shrieked Terry in mock terror. "What you going to do, charge the walls? By the way, very well done on your little bridge. Good effort. Mind you, there's a little bit there that squeaks." Terry pointed at Ziba. "No, don't move," called out Genikos too late. "Squeak!" went Ziba again, squinting in embarrassment. There were cackles of laughter from above. "You shall burn for this! I shall hang your bodies from the towers for all to see! I shall—" began Bob, but again Terry interrupted. "Hey, you what? Sorry, you're still too quiet. I mean, they call you the Great, don't they? You think you'd be—" He was about to say taller. If he had, it's likely that everything would have turned out very differently. The next pages would have been filled with the direst descriptions of death and destruction, blood and bile, fire and fury. Fortunately, Ella arrived on the scene and pulled Terry and her city back from the brink. Those below suddenly saw the head of the provocateur disappear unceremoniously. There were brief, muffled sounds of angry voices similar to that of a maths teacher admonishing an underachieving child for not handing their homework in for the third time running. A new face appeared over the wall, a female one, smiling. "Hello!" called out Ella, waving. The only response from below was a shy wave from Ziba. From afar, the two regarded each other. Ella, nearing the end of her second term as mayoress, was getting lonely, the burden of power weighing heavily upon her. She was, in all honesty, looking forward to being a normal citizen again and being able to socialise normally. In short, she wanted a boyfriend. Nothing serious, just one to see her through for a bit. From afar, the waver looked nice, if a little young. She recomposed herself. "Hi, I'm Ella. Ella the Perfect Fifth, in fact. I am mayoress of Try." Bob and company scratched their heads. What she was saying sounded positive, friendly even, but they couldn't quite make out the words. Ella got the gist. She had to get down. "I'm coming down," she called as loudly as she could. "Ah, she's coming down," echoed Cedric to the others. "Yep, got that," said Bob, impatiently toying with his sword. Ella turned round. "And don't you say another bloody word," she hissed at Terry, adding, "and I'm using your bucket thing." Terry looked on forlornly as Ella marched over to the hole that contained the elevator system. She sat down in the container. It didn't budge. Of course, she thought, she was too light. "Give me that child," she commanded to the group of onlookers. Began the mother of the young girl. "Now," urged the mayoress. The young girl bolted forward, actually looking forward to the ride. Ella was, in fact, a friendly person, just one in a big rush. The girl enjoyed her ride down, and it was something she was able to use as an anecdote for the rest of her life. A small hatch on the front gate opened. A smiling female face peered out. "It's her," pointed out Cedric. "I'm going to chop her head off," roared Bob. He'd been waiting too long and he wanted blood. Ziba didn't like the sound of that, but he did like the look of the face at the door, especially when he caught sight of her eyes looking at him. "My lord," he interjected, thinking quickly, "methought I did have a vision about this very moment." Bob stopped waving his sword and turned to his seer. "I heard a voice, sing your praises as the man who conquered Troy. It was a dream just before sunrise, when the sky was full of coloured light behind the clouds. But there was one ray of light that burst through the clouds and into the voice of one woman. This voice seems like the one before us now. I believe she is the vessel to our victory. The gods want her to live. This is how they will deliver the city to you. What? No blood? No fire? Sire, Lord, if you want your men to live and the gods to love you, then let this woman live. Let her speak. Ella hadn't heard it all, but she did see that the young tall man had somehow placated the short, angry man with the sword. The four of them proceeded across the rocky and squeakless path to the front gate. Ella remained behind the protection of the great gate and the faced-sized hatch, as the one she rightly guessed was Bob was still fiddling with his sword, and he did have a reputation. "Good evening, chaps," she began. "We've come for one thing only," started Bob. Ella guessed he wasn't going to say a refreshing drink or to borrow a cup of sugar. "Your total and utter surrender," said Bob predictably. "Oh," remarked Ella, convincingly feigning surprise. "No need. Honestly, chaps, no need for that. See, you can come in. In fact, you're invited." "Huh?" managed Bob. "Yes, well, I mean, you've gone to such spectacular and frankly unprecedented effort to get here. We thought it only right for you to have you round for dinner. In fact, what the hell? Stay over." While Bob, Jennikos and Cedric exchanged bemused looks, she winked at Ziba, who beamed back. "My lord," he entreated his master, "do you not see now? She is offering us the city. Just as I said, no bloodshed." Bob nodded slowly and looked up again at Ella, who smiled sweetly back. "Come in for dinner?" asked Bob. Ella nodded. "Yes," she replied. "Not just you. Why don't you bring your friends too? All of that lot on the other side of your lovely new bridge causeway thing. Bring the women and kids too. We've got a lot of food saved up, and it'll just go to waste." "You're just asking us in?" checked Bob. "All of us?" "Yes, of course," smiled Ella. "More the merrier. To be honest, it's been a bit dull recently being locked in here. Couldn't wait for you to come over. Here, let me get this gate opened." She shut the hatch and called out some orders. The enormous wood and metal doors swung slowly open. Ziba felt the doors suck some of the outside air in past him. The opening revealed a scene that none of the forward party could have ever predicted. Stood before Bob and his entourage were hundreds of people holding plates piled high with food. They called out, "Hi!" and waved. A banner emerged saying, "Welcome, Bob." Bob was befuddled. This had never happened before. Not remotely. Not ever never. Certainly there had been cities that he had taken without a battle. With his reputation going before him, many places had surrendered without even being asked. The consequences of refusing the marauding emperor or trying to fight him off were terrifying. But faced with this counter-attack of friendliness, he found himself with no choice. "Cedric, go and get the others," he commanded. Chapter 7. A New Dawn, a New Day. It was a long night. Food was eaten, wine was drunk, candles were burned to the end, and many thousands made merry until the sun reluctantly poked its nose cautiously over the horizon, not wanting to disturb the delicate heads of the revellers. Ziba awoke with an inane grin. Sunlight filtered through the soft, creamy cotton curtains and onto his new love, the perfect Ella. Morning sun rays played across her face, and the sound of the waves lapping the side of the city calmed his mind. This, he decided, was the life. He had found what he'd been looking for. Whilst he'd spent quite a while in the company of the beguiling mayoress, he had also had some fascinating and in-depth conversations about, in alphabetical order, astrology, chronomancy, geomancy, naviology, a new thing called tasseomancy, involving reading the used leaves of a substance called tea, and even scatomancy. Yes! He sighed. He was tired of travelling and loved the sound of the waves through the window. Try seemed like a fun place, and if he was honest with himself, he wouldn't be very welcome back home in Bidoop. He'd been the odd kid of the village, always staring at poop or entrails or hoof marks, wondering what they could tell him of the past and the future. He'd always hoped there was actually something in all this antsy business. He could do with settling down and studying it, and the men he'd met yesterday were interested in similar things to him, and they had tales of far-off lands where they had picked up new skills. The ladies, too, were interesting. His eye had been caught by a few more during the long, rowdy evening. He looked again at Ella. She was very attractive, but she was a bit older. He wondered how long a relationship would last. Just as he was wondering all this, there was a timid knock at the door before it gently swung open. A woman about his age entered carrying 2 mugs with a steaming liquid inside. She saw Ziba and smiled coyly. Ziba smiled back. Ella suddenly sat up. She was used to waking quickly, being mayoress and all, and in truth she had been pretending to be asleep for a while. "Thank you, June," said Ella, taking one of the mugs. "Thank you, June," said Ziba, taking one for himself. "Ooh, hot," he added, looking at the young woman as his and her hands briefly touched. June retreated to tidy up and find her mistress's clothes for the day. Ella took a sip and then wasted no time. "Ziba, isn't it?" she asked her companion. "Yes, Ziba. I'm from Bidoop, but—" "Ah, yes. Ziba Bidoop, the scat man. That's what Bob called you. Why is that?" "Oh, I have an interest in scatomancy, the art of foretelling the future by—" "Oh, yes, I remember now," interrupted Ella, slightly revolted. She wanted to enjoy her morning cup of tea. She'd seen the looks exchanged between him and her maid, and saw an opportunity not to get tied down. "Do you like it here, Ziba? In Try?" "Oh, yes, very much." "Good. You can stay if you like. But Bob?" "Bob will be leaving. In fact, you can help me with that." "I can?" "Yes. I have to go now, but drink up your tea now, and tell June what you see in the leaves." Chapter 8. Great Bob's Up. Bob awoke. He cried out immediately in pain. His head did not want to be moved, though his insides craved to be emptied of solids and liquids that pushed hard on the outside of whatever organs they filled within him. With an almighty effort he lifted himself up. Quite why there were so many other people in the large bed was beyond him. Somewhere around the 4th flagon of wine and/or 3rd suckling pig, his powers of recall gave up. "Where's the shittery?" he demanded of the first person whose eyes he saw open, a young bedraggled man on the floor, who may or may not have been one of his officers. It was hard to tell. Everyone seemed to have swapped clothes during the night. "That way, Gov, and turn right," croaked the man, pointing to a doorway. On completing his business, Bob decided to go for an explore. He felt oddly comfortable walking around, lighter, fresher than usual despite the throbbing in his head and the fact that he gagged at the smell of his own breath. On investigating, he realised this was because he was wearing a flowing, silky white dress. For a second he was horrified, but then his hungover mind decided not to care. He had conquered lands across the known world, apart from the beasts that lived within the swamps and dark forests, of course. He could wear what he liked, especially if it ventilated him as pleasantly as his current apparel did. It was the only plus point to his physical state. Mentally, he was still cruising in neutral. He hadn't recalled much from the night before. From what he could see, bodies strewn around the floor, broken vases, spilt wine, he figured that the night before had entailed either a massive party or a great victory. He assumed the latter, or perhaps a mix of both. That would be perfect. Still, he wasn't sure he'd have conquered a city whilst wearing a dress, no matter how much it comforted or suited him. He staggered on and out of the residential area. He discovered that he was a few floors up. The extra swirly feeling in his head as he was suddenly greeted by open air and a long drop confirmed that. Sounds entered his head and his brain worked furiously to decode them. Looking down over some carved pine banisters, he saw a busy marketplace below him. People were bustling, baking, hithering, thithering, cooking, washing, chatting, a few even whistling. Perfumes of freshly prepared food and steam from hot drinks wafted upwards towards him. He felt a modicum of his regular consciousness beginning to burrow its way towards the front of his brain. He became aware of a presence beside him. "My liege, breakfast is ready. Mayoress Ella, the perfect fifth, awaits upon your pleasure." A smartly dressed, tall, efficient-looking woman stood beside him, her eyes fixed straight ahead as if she was part of a military parade. Beside her was an oldish, weary-looking man. "Who are you?" demanded Bob. "Deputy to the mayoress, my lord. For the duration of my service I am known as Number 2. Bob flinched slightly. He'd had a tough time of it in the toilet, though it had been worth it, and he felt several pounds lighter, which in all probability he was. "And what do you do then?" he asked of the man. The man shrugged. "Dunno really, just follow her round, do what I'm told. Someone pays me." Bob didn't know what to think. He didn't have time. "This way, please, great Emperor," said Number 2, showing the way with the palm of her hand. "And may I add what a delight it is to see you looking so well and so fashionable. I'm certain the people of Try will be copying your look in days to come." Bob had indeed begun to notice that many of the men were wearing dresses. It seemed it hadn't taken him long to go native. He was presented with a comfortable pair of fur slippers and led down the stairs to the marketplace below. As he was slowly shown through the thronging streets and alleys, people looked appreciatively at him. Men nodded, then turned and whispered to their friends. Looking behind him, Bob could see them rushing to a clothes stall selling white fabric and dresses. He walked tall, feeling slightly better after the night's revelries. Outside an official-looking building was the mayoress. She bowed low and greeted him. "Good morning, Emperor. I trust you had a good evening in the company of our humble and welcoming people and city. It looks like everyone is impressed with your attire this morning." Bob looked for signs of trickery or subversion in her voice or demeanour, but there was none. She keenly pointed to the cloth sellers, now doing good business in white fabric, similar to what he found himself wearing. "But forgive me," continued his hostess, "you have been offered no nourishment." Ella snapped her fingers. There was a flurry of activity behind her, and a seat at the head of a table in the street presented itself. In front of him was a mug filled with steaming liquid. "Please, drink," motioned Ella. Bob tentatively sat himself down, aware of all the eyes upon him. Some of them he thought he recognised, though if he had to admit it out loud, he would say that he'd never been all that good with faces and names. "What is this?" he asked warily. Chapter 9. Bob's Off. "Tea, my lord," called out a familiar voice. It was his most trusted general, Genikos, who stepped forward and presented himself. He, at least, was still dressed in some semblance of military uniform. "I had some upon wakening, and it is most revitalising." Bob nodded. He decided to give it a go. It was, indeed, as Genikos had suggested, revitalising. The bitterness was oddly refreshing. He finished one cup, and then, after having devoured a sweet bready cake, started on another. "This is good," he pronounced. Ella smiled back joyfully. "We so hoped you would like it. It comes from a land far to the southeast, brought to us by traders and pirates who brave the wild seas." "Good, good," replied Bob. "We must take some with us on our next conquest. It will keep us alert and refreshed." The crowd concurred that this would be a great idea. "Tell me," continued the Great One. A splodge of cake left his mouth and landed on the table. Ella's smile didn't waver. Where is my seer? What has become of him? I must consult." "Look no further, Emperor. Here he comes," answered Ella. The crowd parted, and Ziba strode through purposefully, followed immediately by June, Ella's assistant. "You called, I answer," he said confidently, and bowed low. "Ah, the scat man," called out Bob. "I require your skills. No doubt you'll be leading me to some animal who the gods have seen fit to send messages through." "No need, my lord. You may stay seated. I have been studying all night." Ziba paused for dramatic effect and spread his arms wide. "In this city the gods are using new means to communicate with us. They have sent a substance across the wild seas with the power to tell the future." This excited Bob. "Ooh, I know. It's tea, isn't it? I just drank some." "Yes, O Great One. There is a reason you just drank tea," said Ziba, leaning in conspiratorially. "There is?" "There is. Allow me." Ziba cleared the table in front of Bob, save for the almost empty mug of tea. It was almost empty since Bob had not wanted to get the leaves at the bottom in his mouth. From his person, Ziba fetched 2 crystals, a feather, and a small wooden toy boat. June had helped him find these things within the last few minutes. He placed the crystals at north and south, then the feather at the west, where the wind flies from, and the boat at the east, from whence the tea travels. Several local fortune-tellers had gathered to see the spectacle and quietly debated what they thought was about to happen. Tilting his head backwards in his own language, which was completely unknown to all around him, he muttered, "O gods, take this short fool away from me so that I may lie with June, and possibly others, and have a peaceful life surrounded by the waves and sun here in Try." He then picked up Bob's used mug, held it high, and then slammed it at force down in the middle of the circle he had created. Bob and everyone else involuntarily jumped in shock. One of the fortune-tellers, herself an experienced tassiographer, was about to call out against the fraud she was witnessing, but luckily she was spotted by Ella, who, with one hard glare, prevented her from speaking. Ziba took his time. He waved his hands over the split leaves, he mumbled, and he held the crystals to his forehead. "Well?" asked Bob at last. "My lord," whispered Ziba ominously. "Yes?" "There is much news." "Go on." "Firstly, my lord, this is a great day." "It is?" "Try is yours. Your triumph is complete." Ella was the first to applaud and cheer, and everyone quickly joined in. Ziba hushed them. "You can rest assured that Try will remain faithful to your leadership. Through Try, you will command the seas beyond the known world." "Excellent," exulted the Great One. "But," interrupted Ziba, "the gods demand something in return. This richness comes at a cost." "Ah, yes, the gods are fickle, but I have not let them down yet," mused Bob, stroking his overnight stubble. "Indeed you have not, so listen well, my lord. You will need to leave Try in the charge of your most trusted man, one who will ensure that trades will continue and will benefit your empire. This line from north to south in the leaves here is their message." "Actually, yes, I was thinking something along those lines myself," said Bob. "I mean, can't leave a woman in charge." He glanced at Ella. "No offence." "None taken, your greatness," answered Ella, still smiling. "There is none I trust more than you, Genikos," said Bob, beckoning the old general near. "My lord, I have served you and your family all my life. You know I'll do whatever you ask, but this is the will of the gods, Genikos, not just me. You will stay and rule in my stead," ordered Bob. "As you wish, my lord," said Genikos, bowing. He turned to return to the crowd, winking imperceptibly to Ella. "My lord, there is more," urged Ziba. One more thing the gods ask, and some news. Okay, get on with it then. My powers here are strong. The wind carries instructions from the gods with great clarity. I wrestled with it all night. I pleaded with them, but now, on seeing the leaves, I can see that their mind is made up. You see this leaf here on the edge? The small one in the water, close to the dominant leaf here. Ziba's finger darted about the table, and Bob's gaze followed obediently. This indicates I am to stay here and try. There are forces across the unending sea who gather, and I must remain here to warn you of the time, should they grow strong enough. Bob's head was filled with contradicting thoughts. There was more beyond the known world. An unknown world. That's where the tea must come from. That's what the mayoress had meant when she talked of traders and pirates. But should he sail out to conquer these lands? How would he know which way to go? Or should he stay and consolidate his power in the known world so as to become too strong for any invaders? And what of his seer? Could he trust him to stay here? Why were the gods commanding? My lord, the last piece of news, said Ziba, prompting Bob from his reverie. Bob looked up, shaking himself back into the scene. What is it? I believe the leaves are telling us of insurrection to the south. In Ulevsi the people are mocking you. It may even be that they will soon acquire tea and become too rich to control. You have seen this? Yes, my lord. As I said, the winds and sea here bring me great power. This is where I must stay in order to protect your empire. Bob looked at his seer, who stared adamantly back. And I see you've a local lass to keep you company. Good. We'll need to leave a garrison here, and they should marry the local women and breed good soldiers. An excellent plan, Emperor. Yes, good work. Bob struggled to remember Ziba's name. He only remembered Scatman, but that was hardly appropriate now. Well, it seems we shall have to change your name now. You shall be Mr. T. As you command, my lord. Bob stood up and put a hand on Ziba's shoulder. And I pity the fool who tries to come between us, though we may be many leagues apart. He turned to the crowd. Bring forth my captains and generals. We have work to do. Ulevsi shall burn. There was a flurry of movement as the visitors amongst them prepared to leave. This mostly involved stuffing their pockets with as many snacks as possible, buying or stealing as much tea as they could carry, wishing an emotional goodbye to new friends and lovers, or, for those who couldn't face the prospect of a long march and more battles, hiding. Bob approached Genikos, clasping him on the forearm in a show of trust and friendship. Genikos, you will command try and bring us great wealth. The tea has much revived me, and we must secure as much of that as possible to trade. Now, as to Ulevsi. Yes, my lord, you must march with all haste. I will gather us a navy. The mayoress has told me of allies in the nearby islands who can supply more ships. As you enter the bay, we will attack from the sea 10 days from now. Good, good. It is all in hand. This has been a good victory for us. Long may they continue, my lord. Cedric, where is my spokesman Cedric? I will need him in the coming days, called out Bob. Cedric, being a head taller than everyone else, couldn't hide. He arrived with a sheepish grin, clasping a mug of tea. Eventually, the great army trudged out of the front gate, led by their white-robed emperor. Every slam of the thousands of feet was accompanied by one small squeak, audible from just within the gate. The head of Terry the Taunter appeared over the edge of the ramparts, but one more glare from Ella prevented him from seeing off their guests with one final insult. The great band of marching men, accompanied by hundreds of wagons, carts, and beasts of burden, eventually began to be lost to the horizon, the threatening sound of stamping boots receding. At last, when they could see no more, Ella, Genikos, Ziba, and June all turned to one another. A big smile erupted on their faces, and they jumped into the air together, holding one another in joy as they bounced on the spot, laughing. As they calmed down, Ella turned to face her people, gathered in the square in front of the great gate. She leapt aboard a barrel, and pumping her fist in the air, proclaimed victory. As the cheers died down, she addressed them all. Ladies and gentlemen of the great and independent city of Troy, I want to personally congratulate every one of you for playing your part in ridding us of the scourge of Bob the so-called Great. A fantastic ambush awaits his army when he reaches Ilevsi, so well done to all of you who chose to leave his company and join us here in Troy. It's a good job he doesn't know about the rest of the unconquered isles. Tomorrow we shall set sail to do our bit from the sea in ridding everyone of that annoying little man once and for all. Cheers and more cheers. Now, I know it's been a strain. We've used every last bit of our reserves and had to part with some of our beloved tea, but I think you'll agree it's been worth it to diminish his power, make new friends, and come out of this all alive. First thing tomorrow, those who aren't involved in the sea trip will start dismantling that ugly causeway. Yeah, and I want to find out what that squeak is outside the gate, added Ziba, to applause and laughter. OK, let's tidy up and then have a good nap so we're ready tomorrow. Well done, everyone. Ella jumped down and went to Ziba and Genikos. Well done, you two. Top-class acting there. You had him so fooled. Only following your ideas, mayoress, replied Genikos humbly. Great to be rid of the little fool. I have to admit he's a great tactician, but so full of himself and he just doesn't know when to stop. But I do, and I'm stopping here. I've had enough of charging round the world, bullying people. Well, I'm sure you'll be happy here. Ziba, I think you had the fortune-tellers fooled as well. If you don't want to learn tea leaf reading properly, I think there's a career waiting for you in the theatre. You know, I think I am better at making things up. I might go and check that out. Thanks, mayoress. Ella bid them goodbye, then turned and looked for number 2, who she quickly spotted, efficiently ordering people around to pick things up and put stuff away. Number 2, she called. The tall, broad woman marched obediently to her superior. The older man trudged slowly behind, taking some time to catch up. Number 2, whispered Ella before he arrived. I've been meaning to ask you. I've forgotten the name of the old chap who follows you around. I mean, he's very useful, sometimes, but... I've no idea, Mum. I thought you appointed him. But he's been hanging around for over a year. I know, Mum. Oh, here he is. Ella smiled at the man, who nodded slowly back. As ever, his thin, unwashed hair hung limply past his cheeks, which bobbed slowly up and down just above his shoulders. There you are, chuckled Ella nervously. I've been meaning to ask you. She leaned in, trying to prompt him to give her his name. He simply raised an eyebrow and said, Yes? Look, just wanted to say thanks for the ideas on sending that boat out to Ilevsi just before the siege started, and your knowledge of Bob and how to flatter him, and use his superstitious nature and generally get us through this unscathed. I mean, you've been around for a while, but I can't for the life of me recall... She couldn't bring herself to say that she didn't know his name or where he'd come from. That's okay, he mumbled. Just doing my bit, you know. Do you mind if I take an early nap? Not at all, Mr... But the old chap simply turned and sauntered off towards a covered alleyway that led Ella knew not where. Chapter 10. What happened next? Well, Bob died at the Battle of Ilevsi. He was shot by flaming arrows from the ships in the bay that he believed to be his new navy. His final words are unprintable here. Ella, much to her annoyance, was recalled for a 3rd term as mayoress following the short-lived disgrace of Suzanne the Suspended Fourth. Luckily, she had a much more peaceful 3rd term of power, and afterwards found love with a flag folder with whom she spent her days with on the city walls, the two of them becoming great friends with Terry the Taunter, much to the annoyance of the subsequent mayoresses. Ziba became a famed playwright, penning such classics as Young Bob, My Part in His Downfall, Parts 1, 2 and 3, The Scat Man, Ziba Bidoop, and I Ain't Getting in No Boat, The Adventures of Mr. T. Try eventually became part of Cachalot, one of the Sven Kingdoms established 1,000 years later. In that time, the Causeway was remantled and dismantled 2 more times by would-be invaders. Though it is part of Cachalot, it has never really been part of anything except itself. Mayoresses continue to be chosen at random, and everyone still takes an afternoon nap, reviving themselves with a nice cup of tea. The end.